former MK Yohanan Plesner to say his views. Okay, thank you very much and good afternoon. It seems as we start to talk about this issue of, everyone calls it equality and sharing the burden, but I don't think anybody can even aspire to change it. At the time, I also thought that the right term, and also the committee that I headed, the official name was to promote the integration in service and so forth. But I think that also in this context, the name of this session, I think, is perhaps better, which means integrating the ultra-Orthodox in society, because that really is the core issue. The first question is, has any decision been reached now that Israeli society has coped with this? Has the decision been reached? Are we now in the stages of implementing some sort of a new layout, new arrangement, new contract that will define Israeli society? I think that we are not yet at this stage. I think the public perhaps thinks that, yes, Lapid, he got a lot of votes, and Lapid and Bennett said this was part of their agenda, and now we have an ultra-Orthodox-less government, so now everything else is details, and the main decision has been reached, and now we're headed for a great change, and it will not be as it was before, and so forth. I don't think this is true. I think that there are 4 words that we need to emphasize, and I will go back 2 steps back in a moment. But this is the implementation, erosion, enforcement, and the gradual implementation of what will happen.
הנושא הזה מצד אחד הוא מהנושאים הכי פשוטים אינטואיטיבית שנשמעים. כמו שאמר ראובן, שכל אחד בציבור הישראלי כמעט הייתה לו עמדה ברורה, כן צריך לגייס, לא צריך לגייס. כל אחד חשב שהוא הבין בדיוק במה מדובר, עד שמתחילים להתעמק בסוגיה, ואז זה כמו הר שאתה מטפס ואתה כל פעם רואה עוד פסגה ועוד פסגה בגלל המורכבות של הנושא.
This is very complex, and perhaps this is a matter of equality or inequality, but when you look deeper, you see that you need a more complex plan of action that has to do with both your coalition agreement and the conclusions you have reached. It pretty much has to do with what I wrote as well in my report. It's very complex. But the challenge here, because this is such a complex issue, is implementation over time. If we are not determined politically or professionally or bureaucratically, if there is no will and motivation and willingness to implement this in the long run, then nothing will happen. I want to remind you that Tal law initially also came to solve this problem, and the purpose of the Tal law was very worthy, and this is a purpose that I would find very difficult to counter, and it was also worded and phrased with words like sharing the burden and equality and so forth, and yet nothing much came of it. And unlike Reuven, I don't think we should be sad for it leaving us, for Tal law leaving us, but I do think that we need to be determined and persistent in the implementation. This should be done politically, of course. And when you look at the political determination, we have Yair Lapid and Bennett, who have included this in their agendas, and they want success. But the political agenda can change, because perhaps the government will change within a year. When I started in politics, they told me not to be an interpreter, not to be a commentator. Now that I'm not part of the government or the Knesset, I can be an interpreter. I think the Prime Minister is going to try to kick Yair Lapid out of the government, and once he gets the approval from Bennett. And I would, if I were the Prime Minister, I would tell Bennett all this closed secret information about the peace process until Bennett's heart will melt, and then Netanyahu will get his approval and will have some political crisis, and Yair Lapid will be kicked out of the government and will get the ultra-Orthodox partners back, and then we'll have a completely different situation. And if you ask me, this is nothing, it's not based on any information, but I think such a coalition will be much more convenient for Netanyahu, and I think he will do this as soon as he can. I don't think anybody should underestimate his ability to do something like that. And this is a scenario, and whatever is implemented, whether it's written in law and whatever is implemented, it has to do with the decision makers, because the decision makers, though it has to decide in the Ministry of Labor and the army how much money it allocates and how we deal with the enforcement question. And so, first of all, it's implementation over time. The second thing is erosion in legislation. We will see that we start off with something, and then it goes to the Knesset, and there'll be all sorts of forces that will say, let's just exclude this, and let's just exclude that, and let's just modify this section and that section, and then we will find ourselves in the same situation as Tal law. And if someone thought that Tal law was a good law, that'll be good for him then. But I think that Israel should really make a real change, and such an erosion in legislation and committees is not a good situation as far as I'm concerned. I think that politically this is not something that you should really jump head over heels over. And this outline that was presented here is pretty much the same outline that we thought of at the time. And I think that when you look deeper into this topic, you see that you can play around with one parameter or another, but at the end of the day, you reach the same sort of conclusion. And the point of enforcement is very crucial, because once you have decided the figures and the quotas and exactly how many will go where and be recruited and so forth, once we take this criminal sanction, this which means that according to the law, any civilian over the age of 18 has to go and serve in the army, otherwise they go to prison. That is a sanction that applies to anyone in Israel, any Israeli citizen. I didn't want this criminal sanction to be part of the law. I have also seen other reasons not to, because we don't want to have yeshivas in prison. That's why that's the reason not to do that. But perhaps it would be reasonable. I don't know if it will stand the test of the Supreme Court, but perhaps to have this one law apply to one society, one sector of society, and another law apply to another sector of society. I don't know if that'll work. But perhaps to say, okay, in a certain number of years, this criminal sanction will apply, but right now, for the next several years, it won't. And there should be a financial incentive. It should be both positive and negative, that will apply both on the institution and on the individual. That individual who we want at the age of 21 to either be recruited to the army or to the civil service. I think the question really is how to integrate the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society, and we think that these are tools for integration that have much better effect, or the need of the IDF. It has an integratory aspect, and at the age of 21, if that specific individual does not feel the price, I don't want to talk about the technique exactly, what mix of positive incentives and financial positive and negative incentives should be, but if the individual does not feel the price it needs to pay, if in effect they only take away the 800 shekels they get, then you say, okay, at the age of 21, so I don't get the 800 shekels, okay. Most people don't get 800 shekel, and they even pay when they want to go study in university, and nothing will change. And how do I know this? Because we've already done a small pilot in mid-2012. Maybe you remember, but about 11,000 were let go of under the Gabay ruling that they decided right before the Supreme Court. There was a thesis by the government saying that everything was fine, and they reached this resolution that they will just take time, and about 11,000 of the ultra-Orthodox, or 12,000 or 10,000, about 11,000 ultra-Orthodox men were told they didn't have to enroll. And what happened? Many of them remained in yeshiva, many of them did not go into the workforce. And this thesis of if you only tell them you don't need to do the army and they will be integrated, that is just wrong. You have to use tools such as a military or civil service with a lot of training before, during and after, giving them professional training, professional experience. Only then will they undergo a social change that is really deep and really necessary. So if you don't have a right tool for enforcement, you also won't have the right, you won't reach the same goals. So I see my time is up, so I will briefly summarize and say that overall, I think that among these three attitudes, to either recruit the first one is to recruit absolutely everyone. That's what most of the secular public wants. I saw a poll this morning that about 70% say you should recruit everyone, equality and so forth, and about 15% wanted the former settlement, the former arrangement, which is the Tal law, which in essence the former arrangement and the one of the Tal law, when you look at future arrangements, it's a matter of what the duty of service is, which means is the individual required to serve unless he is one of those very few people who gets an exemption, and later you try to reach all sorts of compromises, but at the end of the day, whether it's Elkin, Atias, Bogi, each time you call it something else, but they always said that the ultra-Orthodox individual can study as much as they want and then get their exemption. Everything else is sort of abstract goals that apply to a system but not to individuals. So about 15% want this attitude, which is about mostly the ultra-Orthodox, and then there's 5% who go against their instincts, but I think it's the right way, and even though now that I'm not a politician, I don't have to worry about losing votes, and so I think that the right way is the way where you have to look into the details and really be determined in implementation in the long run.